For the hey Connor, for the energy systems stuff
Mhm.
with so obviously you're determining what your rate limiting factor is, right? So if you're delivery, then you train a particular way, or if you're respiratory, it's a different way. With that, then is it a case of just redoing the tests and seeing where you've changed on that scale? So it's whether if it's the speed preservation test, you've got those 8 different categories, and therefore you change your intervals to the next one up. But I suppose is the I suppose it's sport dependent, right? The idea will be if you're a so tell you what, then reframe my question. Which sports would match? Where would you want to be for each of those different types? So if you're a marathon runner, you'd want to. Is everyone trying to get to the middle, or it doesn't
Great
sound like it
question.
would be the right thing? You see what I mean? You see where I'm going?
Yeah, I do. I do understand what you're saying. So as you'll see later today, I'm going to show you guys a 100-meter sprinter as one of the case study clients. And the energy system stuff is within the context of what we talked about last week. And obviously every person who plays a sport is going to be using some sport specific energy system development stuff. That's just like, what happens when you go practice. So I think, especially in the off season, this stuff is very beneficial to help fill in the gaps. And yes, to answer your question about the testing, it is test and retest, just like anything else we've been talking about in this course. But also, obviously, the changes aren't going to be immediate. They're going to be over a long period of time. I try to retest about every 8 weeks with that stuff because I think before that, it's too frequent. And beyond that, how do you know if you're really making a change? So yes. So for example, my 100-meter sprinter, what I'll show you is some energy system stuff we did as it relates to last week, but obviously it's separate than the sport specific sprint work. So obviously he still needs a sprint, but he's not going to necessarily get what he needs in terms of his tissue quality through sprint training. But at the same time, I think we only have a finite amount of resources. So taking someone completely out of, what they need to do to succeed as an athlete can be detrimental. But I don't think everyone should be in the middle. I think people should be where they need to be for their sport. Remember, like the gas tank analogy with the marathon runner and the sprinter. I think the sprinter needs to empty their gas tank and use all their oxygen, whereas a marathon runner needs to have that be slowly dripped out over time. But I think at the same time, the biggest gains you can get from training someone is to fill in the gaps of what they don't have. Thanks, Ryan. And so it's a traditional idea of if you've got someone who's doing a lot of sprint work, have them do a little bit more aerobic stuff. You have someone who's, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rich.
No, sorry, someone was shouting in the house. Put it on mute.
Okay. And if you have someone who's doing a lot of long duration work, a lot of aerobic work, if you increase their top speed, then everything relative below that is going to improve. It's that same principle.
Yeah, cool. Cheers.
Mm-hmm. Anything else before we get started? It is super comfy. It's a lot bigger than my last one, that's for sure too. Yeah, my last one, I couldn't even fit on it. Okay, I guess that means we're gonna get into it. So let's rock and roll here. And then at the end, make sure you guys stick around for the end here because I'm gonna talk about what next week is gonna be. Next week is gonna be a little bit different. Okay, so I'm gonna take you guys through 3 clients that I've had in the past and basically just discuss what I did with them and how I would, if I was recommending a beginner with these principles starting off, what I recommend you guys do and how you track things. So this first client I have, you guys have probably seen this guy. If you've ever looked at my story before, he's a power lifter. Had a lot going on when we first started working together. He had pretty significant impingement to the point where he could not do a body weight squat or a deadlift without literally feeling significant amounts of pain. Right low back pain on the opposite side of his impingement, which is interesting. Right anterior knee pain, which is not necessarily the biggest deal ever, but it was definitely present. Left neck pain and occasional left pec strains. So I don't want to just talk this whole time. I want you guys to have some input as to what you see just visually And these pictures also aren't the best. The shadows really make things hard to see. So what do you guys see right out of the gate? Like what's apparent? I'll tell you one thing that I look for that you guys might not notice right out the gate. It's the nipple line of this guy. So if you notice his left nipple is lower than his right nipple. And to me, that's an indication he has more pec mass in his left side because that pec is developing and pushing outward, which makes his nipple face closer to the floor. So I would say he has a bigger left pec. And what else stands out here?
It kind of looks like his right hand is lower, so I'm assuming that his right shoulder is a little lower too, but I can't really tell on the picture on the left.
It's really hard to tell, but yes, I think if I drew a line from this trap right here on over, the right shoulder would be slightly lower.
So I know he's wearing pants in this particular picture, but it almost seems like his femurs do turn out. They do externally rotate out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say so for sure. So
Use
this
my
guy,
Jedi powers to see through his pants. Oh.
yeah.
Yeah, Connor.
What's up?
Yeah, you hear me? Yeah. If you go back to the photo, I feel like on the left photo of his back, you could see that his right hand looks more pronated than left. But that might just be me.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. That's a good observation, man.
I don't want to nitpick either, though. You know.
No, I think that's a really good. I don't think anyone's ever pointed that out whenever we've done this before. So that's a great observation, Phil. Yeah, for sure. I wish we could see his scaps better too. You can't really tell anything from that.
Is his left hip higher than his right slightly?
You know, it's
Or
really
should-
hard to say based off of this picture alone. But if you look at this crease right here,
Yeah.
it is higher on the left than the right. I think it's pretty obvious to tell that. And sometimes that can be an indication that his left hip is higher. But something I do with people now, which is really, really simple, and it helps them understand where I'm coming from, is I tell them to just stand neutrally and palpate their ASIS. And then they can usually tell which one's higher than the other. If you guys can tell me my right is ever so slightly higher than my left.
Looks like he's got a bit more muscle mass on the right hand side of his back. So his lat, you can sort of see with his right arm is slightly further away from the body than the left. It's been supported by that lat that's there, which in turn, if that's, that's sort of bigger than the other side, which means it is pec on the left is sort of making up for the lack of the. So I'm looking at with some of the views, I would look at some things, not necessarily with what we've done here. You've got like more structure on the right hand side on the back versus the left, which is the opposite on the front.
Yeah.
It also looks, it could be the lighting, but it looks like he's slightly rotated. So his right shoulder looks further forward. So it looks like it's kind of, to me, actually, from the front picture, it looks like it's slightly lower than the left. And then potentially just with his traps, again, it could be the lighting, but the top right one looks a bit more, what I would say, pissed off. So it's a bit shorter. But that just could be the lighting as it's landing on him.
Yes, I think those are all accurate and good observations. I actually had this guy send me a video of his deadlift, and I forgot I had it up until this point right here. And his deadlift is twisty. So I'm going to try and find that for you guys. Does anyone else have any other observations on this guy before we move? Let's look at his feet. What do we see here with his feet?
Heel strike.
What makes you say that, Ian?
I guess the space between his toes, or it might be mid stance. But it seems like he pronates more on the right side. And there has, just from what I'm seeing, okay, hold on.
Keep going.
It seems like his left side has a little bit more supination, maybe.
What indicates that to you?
There's a little bit more of an arch on the left side and a little bit more and less of an arch on the right, and the left tib turns out a little bit more.
I think it's really hard to tell from this picture. It's really hard because the shadows also give like an indication on some things, but it's just the angle of the picture matters and all that good stuff. But I think the left tibia is more externally rotated than the right for obvious reasons. And I think honestly, what I'm seeing here is him in late stance on the left. I think that toe gap indicates he might have been in a degree of heel strike at the very beginning, whenever that was. But because he is now flattened and forward and out, I think that's an indication that he is more in late stance on the left. And you can also see that on the right. He's also in late stance because that toe is coming in on the right. And this is what's interesting is I think he's one of those cases where you've been in the right for so long, you start to push out of the right and back into the left, which is why I think the left still has a bit of an arch. And I can't really tell from this picture which arch is higher or lower because that left one is turned out. So I think, yes, what I want you to get away from this, what I want you to get out of this picture is that the left is in late stance, but the right is also in late stance, but it's clear that they got there in a different way. Here's his gate video, which is again, not the best.
Coding.
This is not the best gate video, but just some super basic observations, right? What I notice is, look at what his big toes do when he starts walking towards us. Got a pretty big toe gap, right? I also notice that his trunk rotates very minimally. And I also notice that he is just in that late stance where he's out. He duck walks a little bit, right? So how could all of these things relate to the left femoral impingement and right low back pain? Well, potentially it could just be that all of these things, when you have like all these different things going on both sides, it's usually an indication that they're trying to push back into the left. Not always, but a lot of the times it's, hey, I've been in the right side a long time. I'm going to start pushing out on my right, going back into the left. So any other notes on this gait right here?
Something that I
Yeah.
saw is it's the previous slide, but his feet is his left foot is actually behind his right foot a little bit, and normally I think it's the opposite if you'd expect the weight to be on the right side. So that might be what you're saying, where he's pushed back in the left, because even though it's late stance more, it looks like it's bearing more weight because it's further back, it seems.
Great observation.
Right.
Yeah, really good observation. Actually had not noticed that. Yeah, his left
I have
foot
the
is
opposite.
further
My
back.
the right foot will always be behind my left foot, so I've kind of noticed it.
Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, you're right. He is in late stance because as you know, it's watching his gait, he is very forward. And especially, you know, with that neck position. But someone can be in late stance, but they don't necessarily have to have the toe hugging into like their big toe hugging into their second toe, or like having like bunions on their feet.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, like so they can still be in late stance. You just have to watch how they organize their center of mass as they walk to see if it's forward.
Yeah, yeah. And the big toe separation right there, I think this guy kind of grips with his toes a little bit. I think he's trying to claw the ground and pull it to him a little bit. But
I find his upper body in the gate video, like you mentioned before, a lot of powerlifters are like penguins, you know?
mhm,
There's very minimal swing going on like in the upper body.
very
Just
much
very
so.
he looks like he'd benefit a lot from like some meadows rows or some
Mhm.
reaching or some alternating stuff. Like he looks like he does a lot of bilateral upper body lifts for sport and not too much alternating unilateral type of work.
I think
Just an observation.
that's a great observation. I think you could infer that from the context of like who he is, but not only that, like, yeah, people don't often walk like that unless they have a ton of muscle and compression, or they're like pretty significantly overweight. So yes, Phil, that's a really good observation for sure.
His rib cage doesn't look that mobile. I'm trying to say.
Definitely not. No. So this is his assessment. Didn't pass either Obers. Squat is a 3, and I use the PRI squat numbers to sort of score a squat. So a 3 would be parallel. His toe touch, he just passed. He touched his toes. He was fine. Supine knee to chest is pretty limited on the right, like wow, and the left is also pretty limited. Straight leg raise is really poor on the left, and on the right, it's decent. His internal rotation is awful, and his external rotation is full. His abduction is 10 degrees on both sides, and his shoulder flexion is really limited. And this is a genuine shoulder flexion. So like a lot of people, when you lay him down, they can get to like here and it's like, great. But really genuinely where he wasn't extending, where he wasn't, deviating his elbow out, he was right about there. So he's a wide ISA with secondary compensations. Now, what I want to do right out of the gate with this guy is just decompress him. So I'm not going to worry about this Obers, not going to worry about any of this compressive stuff necessarily. I'm not going to even think about his left hip very much right out of the gate, because he has all these superficial muscles that are bigger, closer to the surface, compressing him and preventing the smaller muscles from doing their job, to put it very simply. So his shoulder flexion's got to get better. We got to give him back some internal rotation of the shoulder, because that's glaring, and his external rotation is full, but that's very common in wides with secondary compensations. And his supine knee to chest also needs to get better significantly. We on the same page together so far? So this is what I did with them right out of the gate. Banded lateral respiration chops. These are just the chops where you're going to the side and breathing in, getting some posterior expansion, which is going to be great for this guy. Hook line, hamstring bridge with a low reach, nothing crazy there. And then I did go a little bit asymmetrical right out of the gate, just to introduce him to his pelvis turning to the left and getting him a little bit of that internal rotation bias with the right arm reach, pushing him over there. So this is not in any way going to make a meaningful impact on his asymmetry, but I think because he's supine, and I think because this is a low intensity activity, we can start to introduce his body towards where the direction I want to take it. Lower pull, TRX hamstring curls, the guy couldn't really do anything. Front foot elevated split squat, which interestingly did not give him issues, whereas a bilateral squat did. So we just did front foot elevated split squats to bring him back in gate stance a little bit, with a forward hip shift on the left to start to introduce that. He just did body weight at first. And then we did, for a push, a 90-90 supine alternating press with a neutral grip, because he just doesn't have the shoulder internal rotation to press right now without getting that shoulder irritated. And then half kneeling landmine alternating press, chest supported alternating row for anterior expansion, half kneeling alternating pull down, and a 90-90 side plank with upward reach to give this guy some obliques. He could not feel his obliques at all. The only way he could feel his obliques was if he was in a 90-90 side plank. So I had him do his 90-90 side plank before he did any other activities sometimes. So that would just give him an awareness of what his obliques were doing and where they were. And then I had him go into everything else sometimes. Not all the time, but I would be something I'd do with him frequently at the beginning. Any questions on that? Okay. At the end of the first phase, I called him good in terms of the phase 1 stuff when he presented with this. So if you notice, it's not perfect. And I think that's okay. So if you notice, his Obers is now negative on the right, which is great. His supine knee to chest is significantly better, but still not perfect, but that's okay. His straight leg raise, we didn't really go after, so it's not going to be that much better, but it was a little bit better. Internal rotation is great now, and external rotation is still good. Abduction still limited, adduction better because we went after anterior expansion a lot, and shoulder flexion is looking better, but again, not where we want it to be quite yet. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. And this is just one of those things where it's like, the more reps you get, the more you know when to move on from the first phase. You could keep chasing these perfect numbers, but it's probably going to cost you more time than it's worth. After
And
that, go ahead.
Time frame in this. So you had him, you assessed him, and you give him some exercises. What was the time frame? Do you comment on that later, or do you? Yeah.
Oh, I would love to. Yeah, actually, I don't have it in here, but this took about 2 months. It took him 2 months to get here because he was so locked up. And honestly, it took him a long time to understand how to breathe right. There were a lot of ups and downs for those first 2 months, but after that, things started to click a little bit better.
Hey Connor, you mind going back to the slide, 2 slides back? Yeah, so for phase 1, that kind of routine, is he doing this like exact routine like 3 days a week, or?
Now, this is just, these are like the big boys that I picked. You know, these are like the staples, so to speak. Like he had other stuff, but I think in terms of the principles I was going for, these are the primary movements he was doing.
Okay.
In terms of phase 2, what I wanted to do is clear that left obers. I wanted to get his adduction to be a little bit better, or his abduction, I believe. And his squat also needs to improve because he was stuck at a 3 and he couldn't really get lower without butt winking. So what I did at this point was I did a 90-90 hip lift with a left hip shift. The guy still needed a lot of hamstrings, so we started to introduce the left adductor a little bit. That's just 90-90 hip lift, pull the left knee down, push the right knee up. A left sideline right glute max, and then a front foot elevated split squat with a forward hip shift on the left side only. So this was just getting him to sense that AFIR, and also just the ability for him to get more of a neutral pelvis, because now we're starting to get a little bit more asymmetrical. And again, the goal here is to restore internal rotation where we need to in phase 2. And if that means going asymmetrical, I think that's okay. So in terms of the lower pull, staggered stance deadlift with ipsilateral load with the toes elevated on the left to bias a little bit more internal rotation and get him out of that late stance foot on the left where he is so much. With the lower push on the left, I did a front foot elevated split squat with a contralateral load, hip shift included. And then on the right, rear foot elevated split squat with an ipsilateral load to help him push out of the right. That's a staple split squat. I don't even know, why am I blanking on the word? Exercise, I can't think of the word, whatever. That's what I do for split squats a lot in a left AIC pattern. Hook lying, alternating dumbbell bench press, half kneeling, alternating landmine press, cable split stance, alternating low row, low reach, again, because he still needs some of that upper expansion, half kneeling, alternating pull down, and then we're starting to add some rotation into his life with that side plank with underside reach. The thing is with him is that he was already not doing anything powerlift-y for about 6 months before we started working together. So this is where, you know, real life meets a model like this. He was really frustrated, and especially because the first 2 months, he was really struggling to learn how to feel and sense the right things. And maybe a lot of that was on me for not cueing or saying the right things, but it was a process. So he was getting to the point where it's like, I kind of want to do what I want to do, which is power lift. So would I probably give him in a perfect world, a bench press with dumbbells and let him load it up a little bit? Probably not, but you know, we have to pick and choose our battles sometimes. And I tried to make this the most mutually beneficial program, giving him some of what he needs, but also what he wants. And then in phase 3, he had passed his left obers, but he still had a little bit of left impingement. And I know this guy was overseas. His coach was doing the obers test for him because, you know, I obviously couldn't do it. Squat is now a 4, which is great. Don't think this guy was ever going to get to a 5 squat. And his toe touch is still fine. Supine knee to chest is still a little bit imperfect, but it's not the end of the world. And his straight leg raise is looking a ton better on the left. Everything is looking pretty smooth. Now, basically all I want to do at this point is get that shoulder flexion. Like 160 is a pretty good number for a power lifter. And then also fully clear that left hip impingement. So at this point, what I did was give him a little bit of a left glute med. So it's easy for people to feel an adductor, left obliques, left hamstrings, all that stuff. But to get the glute med involved, So actually, I don't know if Tyler's on this call, but Tyler did an exercise with Ben, and it's the same one that's linked right here. That's my favorite glute med drill, to get someone to sense a glute med, to integrate it with an adductor, to integrate it with the oblique in single leg stance. Love that drill. That's in the corrective exercise week. Gave him some inversion to get him some upper expansion, because the dude still had a pretty significant hump back here, rib hump, but he was really flat in like that T2 to T4 area, and that just wasn't going away. So what we did was we just gave him some inversion to bias the expansion up here, and that worked really well. Staggered stance trap bar deadlift. Now he's just ripping a ton of weight off of the floor. He's feeling pretty good, but he's not bilateral yet. Heels elevated front squat, Swiss bar bench with the heels elevated, and then meaning like there's a couple of 45-pound plates underneath his heels. Dumbbell shoulder press, I can't talk today. Shoulder press with his feet on the wall, and then bent over alternating landmine row, just like you mentioned, Phil, earlier, with a contralateral load. So that would look like this right here. Bent over, weight in one hand, shifted into that hip. And then a V-bar bilateral pull down for his vertical pull. And then core was a carry to get him some of his grip strength back. But also to bias some expansion, either anterior or posterior. I think we did both. Okay, so before we go on to the next person, anyone have any questions on that guy?
When would you put his bilateral like power lifts back?
We did that, like we did probably 3 weeks of the staggered stance trap bar deadlift, increasing the load a ton, to the point where I think he was doing like 405 for sets of 10 on a single leg. And then I was like, all right, if you can do that on one leg, it's time to progress you to regular trap bar. And then he went to conventional. Conventional just doesn't fly with him. He just doesn't respond to it well. So we just went to more narrow stance sumo, and then got him out from there.
And you would just like keep a lot of these secondary exercises similar, but you'd plug in his big lifts, and that should keep him kind of stable.
Exactly. I always had him do primary, secondary. So like, let's say he's doing a squat day, low bar back squat, and then moving to some other bilateral squat, potentially, maybe the front squat. And then we would fill it in with like the split squats, alternating action. And he would always finish off. Like in my powerlifting ebook, what I talk about is do what you want to do, but then at the end, go do this stuff. And then you can really increase your longevity and also your movement options.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Oh, any more questions on this guy? Yeah.
I had a question. Just it's a two-part question. Okay, one is unless they're in pain, then that is when you would start out asymmetrically training them and not bilaterally, or not clearing them bilaterally first.
Yeah, I think that depends. I think if I've got someone that's in pain, then yes, I'm almost always going to take away their bilateral activities, other than like a heels elevated banded goblet squat at first, because they're going to just compensate in their bilateral stance. So if they're not in pain, but they have significantly limited movement, that's a conversation I need to have with them and determine what they want to do. But if they're not in pain and we're just trying to like improve their movement a little bit, and that's one of their primary goals, I'm probably still going to have them bilateral lift.
Okay, and with the Swiss bar bench with the heels elevated, what about what would change if you just elevated the entire foot?
Oh, that is what I did. So basically what I meant by that was you're on the bench press, and then you are placing a couple of 45-pound plates underneath the feet, specifically driving through the heels. So that way they can get the leg drive and not have to use lumbar extension to find their hip extension.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. So this guy right here is probably the most challenging case I've ever had. I'm giving you guys, hard ones because this is real life. This guy had so much going on, but he's narrow, and his case is actually, you guys will probably laugh a little bit at what this guy's goals are. But what stands out to you right away with this guy? I see that right tibial External rotation. I mean, there's a lot of things. He's got a little bit of pectus excavatum.
He seems to have that left IC thing going on where his left foot looks slightly in front of the right, and then he looks twisted. He looks like his neck is kind of twisted to the left to kind of look forward.
Yeah, his
Might just be the
left
angle,
trap-
but
Yeah, no, it could be the angle for sure too, but his left trap is more developed than his right. I think that's pretty objective right there. Honestly, it kind of looks to me like his right heel slightly ahead of his left. And looks like he's laterally bent to the left a little bit. And also look at what his gut is doing. Look at the line of his hair, first of all. That's interesting how it slopes down to the right. And also look at what his abdomen is doing, how there's an indentation on the right. So I think that's a sign he used to be in the sort of, right ab wall dominance, just like the left DIC pattern is. But I think he's built some other stuff on top of that. In fact, he certainly has. Now this one is even more telling, I think. And it could just be the angle. But what I noticed right away is that his left, look at the second picture right here. You can see his left lumbar erector. And on this angle, you can't see that, but you can see his right nipple. And you cannot do that. So I think this guy's pretty clearly rotated to the left. I think his pelvis is in some sort of orientation where he is now rotated left.
good.
Anything else you see? I think his arches are pretty high. He's got a pooch belly. They're classic of narrows. You can see his pectus a little bit.
Does he lock his knees? Does
I
he
can't
ever-
really tell from that. Yeah, I don't know. But I think just in general, to answer your question, because I know this guy, yeah, he would. And then this is his intake. This is everything. Somehow this guy knew everything that had ever happened to him in his entire life. But this is what was going on. And it's a lot of it. And there's a lot of minor things, but there's also a lot of significant things. This guy just had a lot going on. There was one thing one day, one thing the next day. And you guys can read that in the slides later, but there's just a lot. This is his gait video. I noticed that his right arm it looks paralyzed. His right arm. His left is swinging a little bit more, especially when it comes back. Just doesn't move that right arm. What else do you guys see?
His big toes look really spread.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So toe off.
Yep. Trying to grip the floor probably.
His rib cage is there. So his rib cage is there's not a lot of mobility to it.
Yeah. Yeah, he's stiff.
I have a quick question.
What's up?
So he named all of these issues on his intake. Are these self-diagnosed issues, or are these actually diagnosed from a physician?
I think some of these are diagnosed because this guy had seen a ton of people. This guy had seen, he's from the Netherlands. So he'd seen I don't know how much, progressive sort of practices are over there, but I think also a lot of this is self-diagnosed, but I think a lot of it is actually genuinely diagnosed because he saw a lot of people. Let's take a look at this is the best part. This dude wanted to be an MMA fighter, which is like, all right, dude, good luck. So he wants to sort of really get himself training and running again without pain. He's 26 years old. He used to be a recreational MMA fighter. And this is his assessment. So I think the things that stand out to me the most is that his supine knee to chest is crazy on the left, but on the right, it pinches, but he gets to 110. And he got pretty far before it pinched, past 90 degrees. It usually pinches around 90, but it didn't for him. SLR is ridiculous. What do these two things probably mean?
Anterior pelvic tilt.
For sure. Yeah, I think he's starting like that. So he's just flinging himself back, but he's starting in a position of hip flexion already. And I think the reason why, if you look at the rest of this measurement, the rest of this assessment, his shoulder flexion is way better on the left than the right, which is like, whoa, something's going on here. His external rotation is better on the left than the right, which is, again, not what you would expect. So what I think this guy has is a lateral pelvic orientation. In fact, he's a classic case of it. And I think the reason why he pinches on the right is because if he's lateral like this, and then he's laying down, remember how the laterals, you might feel a little pinch in here because you're literally impinging on the acetabulum when he brings it back. But because he was starting in hip flexion, he was bringing it back past 90, but it was really probably about 90 for him genuinely. And he was impinging because he was like this. So right out of the gate, what we need to do is just get this guy under control first. Dude didn't know how to breathe, didn't know how to do a lot. So I'm not really super concerned about this pelvic orientation at first if this guy can't even, put the pieces together to sense the right things at the right time. So shoulder ER's got to get better, shoulder flexion's got to get better. Those are things he should have as a narrow, and his straight leg raise, I want to make it worse because he needs to get out of that anterior pelvic tilt. He needs some hamstrings to help him do that. So because this guy, everything hurt, and it's just the laterals are really hard. Laterals are out, like, just full transparency. Laterals are the hardest people to work with that aren't, motor vehicle accident people or something crazy. So they're really challenging, but a lot of the times if we start slow and don't rush into things, we can see a lot of good progress. So I started him off with just basic sideline hamstring tilts, 90-90 hip lift with a passive ball hold because he's narrow. And the dude just, he palms the floor, squats ass to grass, no problem. And this guy needed to just get himself under control and open up his pelvic outlet a little bit because he was just so far here and dumped forward. He needed to open up a little bit. So I gave him just some passive adduction. And then inversion breathing, just passively over a couch, not supporting himself with his weight whatsoever, is really beneficial for him because he just had so much restriction in his rib cage. I just wanted to get that thing to expand. So lower pull was just hamstring curls with sliders, goblet squat to 90 degrees and ball between the knees to get him to control. Because when he squatted, he just he fell. He didn't control it. He just, he bypassed this. He just went from here, drop down. There's no control. So that's why I added some tempo to that squat just to make sure that he could own it. And then 90-90 alternating floor press with a neutral grip. Didn't give him an upper push, vertical push or pull because he didn't have the shoulder flexion to do it. And I just didn't trust that he wouldn't compensate like crazy. And then he did a high seated alternating row at a 60-degree reach. And then the lateral cable respiration chops. At this point now, he still has an Ober's that is positive on both sides. His supine knee to chest is a little bit less pinchy, but nothing crazy, which I don't really expect it to be because we haven't really gone after that lateral orientation yet. Straight leg raise is a hell of a lot better. Internal rotation is looking about the same. External rotation is looking a lot better. Shoulder flexion is looking a lot better. This took about 3 weeks to get here. But it can vary, right? So I think this is pretty acceptable for phase one for this guy because this guy's biggest problem is his lateral orientation, but we just need to get him to, get in the groove a little bit, so to speak. So now what I want to do is restore internal rotation, the obers, and shoulder flexion. I want to get that shoulder flexion just a little bit better because it's still 120 on the right. So what we did at this point is an adductor pullback on both sides and all 4 breathing, and then the 90-90 isometric hip shift to get him to restore some internal rotation. And then staggered stance deadlift with toe elevation. We avoided deadlifts of any kind, hinges of any kind at first, because he just couldn't do it without feeling his back. Split squats, he had built up an okay amount of strength within that 3 weeks to be able to do this without compensating like crazy. Alternating dumbbell bench press in a neutral grip, split stance landmine press, contralateral load. And yeah, the wall reference bear plank and bear crawl were also great to restore some IR in his shoulders as well. At the end of that phase, he was now kind of back into this general left AIC, but he still has the lateral orientation. So he's presenting as more of a left AIC, but I think at the same time, he still has this orientation issue going on. So we know that because of the shoulder flexion measurement, because of his straight leg raise and the supine knee to chest, not quite as dramatically asymmetrical as they once were, but definitely still need some work. So remember, in lateral orientations, what we want to do is we want to push back to the left and then shift in the left. So that's what we did here. Left sideline, right glute max, prone right propulsion drill, and then a left hip shift squat. So if you've got a lateral, this took us, I don't know, 2 months to get to this point. No, probably more like 6 weeks, 6, 7, 8 weeks, something like that. And that's a long time to get to this right here. And this is what I encourage for beginners. There are some ways in which you can do this earlier, but I would discourage you guys from rushing through things at first, because I've made so many mistakes going too fast with people. And it's so much better to take it slow, make sure you're getting objective improvements, because there are worlds in which you can just give someone these 3 things day 1 and they feel better, but it doesn't stick and it doesn't hold and it doesn't carry over to the rest of their lives after about 15 minutes, because you haven't down regulated their, lats, their pecs, all these other things. So while these things do work at first, I would highly encourage you guys to stay patient at first, go through the 3 phases. They're there for a reason, because as you get better as a practitioner, you'll be able to know when you can intervene earlier with this stuff. But I would just say, be really patient. And if you go too fast, things aren't going to stick. But maybe they will. I don't know. I can't say black and white. So staggered stance, trap bar, deadlift, toes elevated on the left, SSB squat to a 90-degree box that had some tempo on it, offset push-up to give him some more IR, and also alternating expansion compression. Wall reference Arnold press, because he now has a shoulder flexion to handle it. Croc row, and then tall kneeling alternating pull down, because he has the hip extension to do that now, and a bear crawl for his core. So at that point, he was pretty much good to go. And I actually talked to him a couple days ago for the first time in probably like 6 months, and he's still doing well. He still does his drills. I think he does like 2 sets every day of, I think, these drills right here. And he's totally fine. I think he's kicking some ass in the gym. A croc row is just like, let's say this is my bench right here. I'm back here. It's just a bent over supported row on one arm. Now this is an athlete, and I want to incorporate an athlete because, I mean, a lot of you guys will work with athletes, and this guy's a narrow. And right out of the gate, what do you see with this guy?
Looks like he's shifting over to his left.
Yeah, it kind of does.
Looks like he's supporting all of his weight on his left foot.
Yeah, I don't know if that was just like what he was doing in this picture or what. I think I have a couple more pictures of this guy. I got a lot of gait videos of this guy. So yes, I think his right shoulder is higher than his left for sure. And this guy's clearly standing on his left. I think other things I'm looking at is his left oblique looks more developed than his right. He's got a little bit more of that V cut right here. And also his left pec seems to, at least in this picture, be a little bit bigger than his right. And look at how you can see his left nipple pretty clearly in this picture. And I don't think this is just the, it could just be a little bit of the angle of the camera, but I think this guy's rotating his trunk to the right a little bit. He has right shoulder impingement that's previous, but still flared up every once in a while. Left mid back pain around T8, which is past and current, and right glute pain during heavy squats. Not during light squats, but during heavy squats. He had this weird right glute pain.
His arms kind of externally rotate, they supinate a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think that's indicative of him being a narrow bias towards ER, which is gonna turn out his hands a little bit. Here's his gait videos. This guy's a great athlete. And I know you guys aren't, I'm definitely not the best person in the world at analyzing gait, but I think we can pick up a couple of things here. I think what I'm still noticing right out of the gate is his left shoulder is lower. Look at how he doesn't really, in terms of his right arm and left arm, look at how his left arm doesn't swing back as much as his right. Again, I think it's an indication he's rotating his trunk to the right. Pretty flat feet. And notice how the left arm also comes across his midline more. He's got a lot of arm swing, but not a lot of rotation through his rib cage. You guys have any other observations? I wish I could slow this video down. Ooh, maybe I can. I can't. That's too hard. Do you guys notice anything in this? I know I do. Anything at all? His left arm gets higher than his right. Noticing a little bit of tibial ER. And then here, I don't know if you guys can see it. I think it's apparent in the first couple of steps he takes. But look at what his pelvis is doing. Can anyone tell me what's going on within his pelvis when he walks? The first couple steps. It's kind of hard to see, but do you guys see it? Can anyone tell me?
Is he hitching his right hip up?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
You can kind of see it with his, not necessarily at the hips. It looks like he's picking his right foot up and throwing it forward.
Yeah.
It looks like kind of, which is that kind of, he's got a circular motion going on there, which means it's hitching up.
Yeah. Okay. This is what he presented as: positive left, negative right. Squat was parallel. Toe touch was mid shin, so he couldn't re-counter nutate. His supine knee to chest was, pretty classic of someone who's an athlete and, back squats and deadlifts all the time. Straight leg raise is a little bit better on the left than the right. His HGIR was better on the left than the right. ER is worse on the left than the right. This dude is in a left AIC pattern for all intents and purposes within the context of what we're talking about in the test measurements. But what I think is interesting is what he was actually doing within his rib cage, as we noticed with the trunk rotation back to the right. Now, I think with this individual, he was probably has something called superior T4 syndrome within PRI, which is where the torso counter rotates back to the right above around the T4 region. And we don't cover that in the course because I think if you just get them to pass the tests, you'll be totally fine. But I think that's what was going on with this individual. And as for his priorities, I wanted to improve the supine knee to chest shoulder flexion, and I also want that left obers to improve. Now, this guy's in the off season. He's currently in the off season. So remember what I talked about with athletes and how we don't necessarily want to take them fully out of their pattern when they're in season. But since we were in the off season, I felt comfortable sort of getting this guy to restore more variability. So the first thing we did was a hook lying hamstring bridge with dynamic marching. The only reason I added that is because he's an athlete and athletes hate doing stationary drills. So I gave him something a little bit more dynamic to think about. The left adductor pullback, I couldn't really make this too sexy because he couldn't really feel his left adductor. So we had to make it very basic. Rear foot elevated split squat jumps, just to give him some propulsion and also some just basically unilateral power development. Offset plow push up, just to add a little bit more of that unilateral component to it. And in terms of his lower pull, he was doing these two should be switched right here, the heels elevated squat and the stagger stance deadlift. But that's not that big of a deal. So for his squat, he was doing a banded Zercher squat, meaning that band was around his knees and he was holding just a normal barbell Zercher position. I had this guy bilateral lift because that's what he's used to doing. And if I told him, hey, I want you to, do some front foot elevated split squats with a forward hip shift as your primary, that probably wouldn't have gone too well. So he did those as his accessory, added a hip shift on the left, not the right, trap bar, staggered stance deadlift with the rear heel elevated on his lower push because this guy was heavy mid stance within his feet, and upper horizontal push, hook lying dumbbell alternating press, kettlebell push press for his vertical push. And I know this guy didn't have full shoulder flexion, but again, choose your battles. And I just didn't want to, it was already enough to get this guy to lay on the ground and breathe and do all this other stuff. So I just let him have his fun with his, and I made that a little bit more of a power development. And then side plank cable row, half kneeling pull down, and an ab wheel for his core. As for his conditioning, we did the short duration alternation intervals, because if you guys remember on his assessment, he's delivery limited. So I didn't try to make things too confusing for you guys. I just showed you what kind of training I would do with this guy right here. So this is an example of a workout I would give this guy for energy system development, separate from his sprint specific work, because he still needs to do that. But also this is going to help him just have less compression, have less venous occlusion all the time. Because again, remember, we're off season, so it's okay to do these things. Would I do this in the middle of the season? No. In the second phase now, this guy had a better, but not perfect Obers. Technically it got to the floor, but it was a little clunky on the way down. So I wasn't gonna say this is perfect. I love this. So I wanted to improve that a little bit. Squat is better. Everything is looking a little bit better at this point, but the shoulder flexion is not quite where I want to get it. So shoulder IR's got to get better. Adduction and the left Obers are all things I want to improve on this guy. Prone right propulsion, just to give him a little bit of a right glute, and also just get him to integrate his left adductor with his right glute at this point. And then inchworm crawls to get him inverted a little bit, and also some of that, a little bit more of the anterior upper expansion. Band assisted broad jumps, assisted because this guy's really compressed despite the fact of him being narrow. He's still really compressed because he trains like a serious athlete, because he is one. So I wanted to get him, I wanted to not resist him, because resisting him with a band would pull his guts in the opposite direction. He's already very concentric. I don't need to train that. So I want him to be able to yield a little bit better. I want him to be able to be quicker off of his feet and have his guts go in the direction that he's going to want to be in when he's sprinting. And also the yielding fake slam was very complementary to this, because he needed to essentially just learn how to rapidly absorb and then reproduce that force. So it's very easy for, lots of strength coaches to just say, we need to get you stronger to get you faster. But I think this guy's rate limiting step was his eccentric, in terms of the triphasic graph, his ability to go from eccentric to the, why am I blanking on the word, amortization phase, and then into the concentric. That transition from eccentric to amortization phase, that was more limited than anything else with this guy. So lower pull, heels elevated front squat. Accessory was front foot elevated split squats before tip sheet. You guys already seen this before, right? It's pretty standard. I like to use it, and it's easy to just sub this out because you just use the same box and you just elevate the front foot on the left and the rear foot on the right. So lower push, trap bar deadlift, nothing crazy there. Horizontal push, dumbbell alternating bench press, split stance alternating press. I think you guys are starting to get the idea a little bit. And I gave him pull-ups because he's an athlete and that's what he'd like to do a lot. So I let him have his cake. And that was just 2 phases. This guy didn't need a 3rd phase because he wasn't that bad off. Didn't have a ton of pain. And then for his 2nd phase of conditioning, this is an example. I didn't change the exercises because I wanted you guys to be able to like link up, you know, which one from last week we talked about. But this is a really good thing for him to do because again, it's going to teach him to get a little bit more of that aerobic work, but also not compress. We're making sure he did not get a pump during this. Okay. So now let me wrap up by talking about what's coming up this next week. What I'm going to do is we have a lot of different groups. I'm going to pair, and I know that as the program progresses, the small group meetings get less and less frequent, which is fine. People have things going on in their lives. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pair 2 groups up at a time, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, etc. And I'm going to give you guys each your own case study that looks just like this. And I want you guys to, on your own, analyze it. And then program 2 to 3 phases, whatever you think would be appropriate given the context of the case study. And I want you to assume that the priorities, like I listed out phase 1, 2, 3 priorities, assume you got those to where you wanted them to be before you moved on to the next phase. So for example, if I had this and I wanted to improve supine knee to chest, assume you got the supine knee to chest to 120 degrees on both sides, just for the purposes of this exercise. And then create a conditioning session for the individual and progress at each phase. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy. It doesn't even have to be the same type of session like I chose for that athlete right there. And then assume they're a relatively novice athlete. They're not, you know, extremely competent in everything, but they have a basic understanding. They're like your average personal training client who came to you after working with a couple before, but still don't have, you know, they're still not pros. And then what I want you to do is come together in a small group meeting and discuss and come up with one program that you'll present next week, next Monday, and for everyone to see, because I think it's really beneficial for other people to program, for you guys to be able to do this yourself, because that's what's going to make you, especially when you have the resource of having all these people listen to you and give you feedback, that's going to be huge. So I think this is a massively important part of the program. You get out what you put in. So I think this is, if you guys take this seriously, then I think you're going to really have a lot of success once this program's over working with your own clients. But yeah, just make sure that you do this on your own, meet with your small groups, discuss it. And then after that, have your own one program to present next week. I believe there will probably be 3 or 4 people talking. We'll probably give you guys 15, 20 minutes per group. And then we'll just kind of take it from there and give each other some feedback. All right. Anything you guys want to talk about?
Question: are you still going to do the addendum, like the additional 6-week program after this?
Yeah, so I actually need to put that together, and that's going to take quite a bit of time, but I am going to put it together, and I am going to probably release that. I'll put signups probably at the end of this after the 12th week. And then I will probably have that start. Let's see, that would be probably in March, I think is what I'm aiming for. March 1st as a start for that.
Good. Thank you so much.
Of course, I'm hyped about it because I think it's going to be a really good segue from this, get a little bit more advanced.
I got a question, Connor.
Yeah.
So you talk about having like a rectus strategy and they overuse the rectus abdominis. So like, I kind of get what you're saying, like intuitively, but can you explain like what that is and like why that's a bad thing versus what you want them to be doing?
Yeah, so a rectus strategy, usually for some people, it's one of 2 things. It's either that they're in game and that rectus is kicking on to basically give them an inhalation strategy, because every compensation is an exhalation strategy until the very last one. So they're going to just concentrically orient this, and they're basically just going to use that as a means to basically just get their rib cage to work in some meaningful way. So that's one thing. The other thing they can do is they can just use their rectus all the time as a exhalation muscle. So that would be, I see this sometimes with people who have worked with trainers who have taken like 1 or 2 PRI courses and think flexion is literally the answer to everything. So they'll have these people just like do something like this, and like that's their flexion reach, and like their sternum's depressed, and they're just like exhale as hard as you can until you feel your abs come on and hold that. And then those people will develop a rectus strategy because they're just using that as opposed to their obliques. And then you also see that through people like power lifters who use Valsalva all the time. You'll see that with people who do a ton of, bicycle kicks and never do any oblique work. And you'll just see it with a lot of, generally, I think everyone has a rectus strategy to some extent. It's just how significant is it? Because most people, when they exhale for the first time, they're going to feel their six pack before they feel their obliques, unless they're narrow and they have a lot of lateral compression going on.
Right. So like the idea would be, because if you can get your obliques to facilitate the exhale, you don't have to go into that position where you're compressed here and everything's depressed and you can't get air into your anterior.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then because it also, just to follow up, it seems like any core exercise where you're doing like just a sagittal, like, anti-extension or flexion, you're only always going to be like biasing the rectus. So, because like you're doing a plank, or you're doing like a rolled out or something, there's always a lot of rectus activity. So is that like something that we don't need to focus as much on, or I'm not really sure?
I think it's okay to develop a muscle. I think that's totally acceptable. But I think if you add the respiration component into an ab wheel, if you exhale as you go out, you know what I mean? That can be potentially advantageous for getting the obliques to kick on. Also, on something like a wall reference bear plank, you can get them just exhale longer and then cue jelly belly, like relax your belly fully and then exhale. That's going to be a lot more obliques. The six pack will kick on, but I don't want to demonize muscles. Like hey, everyone's a nice six pack, and I think you can have both.
Okay. Cool. Nice.
Anything else? Nothing at all? It can be anything. It can be absolutely anything. Do you have a client you're struggling with? Hey, Phil, I think you're, I can't really hear you, but I see you're talking right there. Can you guys hear him, or is that just me? Yeah, we can hear you. Still can't. You can type it in the chat. You guys have anything at all? Usually I have a lot of questions.
Connor, I have a client who, it's not like a huge deal, and it doesn't hurt during anything like weighted, which is kind of weird, but it only hurts him when he walks. It's like this lateral pain on the kind of side of his foot / ankle, on his right foot. What would be your, obviously you haven't assessed him or anything, and I've kind of looked at the way he's walked. He definitely presents as like normal left AIC. Is that something that you have found is common just because of the oversupination that's putting like a lateral stress on that right foot, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the Band-Aid scenario for that would be a paper towel arch. If you guys have ever seen Neil Hollinen's, have you ever seen that, Ben? That paper towel arch video?
No.
Oh, let me go get a paper towel.
Is that just where like you pronate the foot like down on a paper towel?
Yeah, kind of. So, all right. So what you can do is you can give yourself an orthotic with a paper towel. You want it to be about yay big, fold it in half, and then fold it in half again, and then fold it in half again, fold it in half again. Now you got yourself an arch. And you put this in your sock underneath. So I would slide this in like right here.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And then you just walk, and now your brain has a reference to push into the ground with something. sometimes that can be enough. And if someone has it just when they're walking, I'll just give them that. And that can be sometimes a very quick and easy fix. Another thing you could do is a sponge would work very well for that. But again, it can't be very big. But yeah, that can be a really good tool. So I'd say try that and have them walk for a day and see how it feels.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. One of my, actually 2 clients of mine have TMJ. One of them goes to a physical therapist and the other one, she consistently, regularly goes and sees her chiropractor to just like have adjustments. And both of them, you know, we've worked on this type of stuff, and like their pain has gotten better, but they're still utilizing these other modalities. And I'm like, well, if that makes them feel better and they think that they're doing fine, then I'm not going to, like you said, take it away from them.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts of like on that?
In terms of what?
In terms of like not relying on like short-term solutions.
Yeah. I think there's a balance to be had there. I think it goes back into like what they need versus what they want. Because people do want instant gratification and a short-term release. So I think using those in combination with, I mean, obviously, I think if you educate them in terms of like what the nervous system is, what it does, and why we hold a pattern, why we hold a certain presentation, I think that can be a really beneficial way to talk about it. That's how I would go about it. I just be like, hey, what you're doing right now, this stuff's great. And it's going to give you an instant release and it's going to feel really good. But the reason why we are in a certain presentation, we hold it over time is because, you know, you can go into conservation of energy, you can go into mechanical efficiency and just like trying to be safe. So it's like, we need to give you things that are going to address all these different systems and we can do both. And then I would just give them that. But I think, yeah, that's just having a conversation, having that person trust you, I think is really important in that context.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just something I've been thinking about. Because you had said, don't take things away from people.
Mm-hmm.
That, and she's like, oh my gosh, yes, you're totally right. Because like, there's a difference between like, you know, like pushing like my expertise, like in my will, and then them being comfortable enough to embrace like, okay, like this new way of doing things. So
yeah, I'm actually
about a lot. Thank you.
I'm glad you brought that up because I actually do have 2 clients and they're laterals and they really struggle with their pain. It's a problem in their lives that's like dominating. And I remember that usually I have half an hour weekly check-ins with my clients, but sometimes if I don't have another call, we'll just like chat and we'll hang out. And I remember one time I didn't have a call for the rest of the day. So we were just chatting and we were just like having a discussion. And, you know, we were like just chatting about random stuff. And then we tried the same exercise, like, oh, wow, wait, we actually need to do some work here. So we did an exercise that we had tried before. And he just like looked at me afterwards, like, I just feel like my body exhaled. And it was just like a very powerful moment for him because he felt so much of his pain go away. But also, we didn't really change much other than the fact that I think throughout that conversation before, we had built a rapport and we had, you know, established some subconscious trust. And that was, I think, a massive reason why. So I think also what he had mentioned in the conversation is like an exercise like that gave him instant relief. So we had that conversation. We tried that because that's what he wanted to do. And I think that made him feel the best he has in, I don't know, a year or longer, because I think that psychological aspect of things is so important. And I had a very similar thing happen the other day. So I think, you know, the more I do this, the more I question how much of it is that person feeling safe around us and our confidence in what we do versus, you know, the actual technique itself. I don't know. It's just something I think about.
Well, that's where you're stepping into having the nervous system actually being the primary driver and everything else falls off the back of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just I mean, just like, because if you look through the polyvagal theory, you've pulled that up in one of, I think it was in the anterior pelvic tilt book. I think you'd mentioned it, but yeah, no, I read that book, and it's just it's basically taking people back through that phylogenetic hierarchy back to be actually being in that flow state, so they will accept whatever treatment that you provide to them. I'll actually send it. I'll find the book and take a picture of what the exercise is. But there's a guy who utilizes those theories as part of. He does. I think he's a psychiatrist, so he's not allowed to lay hands on people. But there's a thing he has them do, which allows them to get more parasympathetic prior to him talking to them, which then he has much better results with them. And it is literally like you get someone to lie on the. I suppose you can do it. Might be able to do it standing up, but you interlock your fingers, put it behind your head, lying down, and you keep your face straight forward and look as far as you can to the right hand side. And after about 30 seconds to a minute, you'll either sigh or swallow, and you then come back to the middle and then go to the other side, sigh or swallow, and it's taking you back into that parasympathetic state. And you can even see it in. You'll be able to test them if they've got tightness in their traps, as well as being able to see a difference in the epiglottis and the tonsils as well. So it's a way of being able to see how that goes. So yes, you'd put your interlink, so you're nice and relaxed, face pointing up towards the ceiling, look as far as you can, as hard as you can over to the right hand side, and just it's a night of breath. And after 30 seconds to a minute, you might feel like you're going to sigh, yawn, or swallow.
Do I breathe relaxed, or do I just sort of nasal breathe?
Just relax, just nice relaxed breath.
Should my eyes strain?
Yeah.
Okay. You guys are probably like, this is not what I expected to see today.
This is great.
Yeah, exactly. It's good for good watching, right? Yeah, but if you try it's just when you feel like that, to swallow or sigh or yawn, you then come back and you go to the other side as well. It's a good thing to finish.
I feel like it's coming. I think just the fact that, I have 13 people watching me right now might have something to do with that. I'm sympathetic, but I think I could literally feel like, when you're about to sigh and you feel it like the back of your head.
Yeah.
I got that.
Yeah. It brings people back into I utilize this, or have done in the past with people at the end of a CrossFit class. So you get them to lie down and do this, particularly if they've just smashed themselves into the ground, they've gone into almost freeze mode. So, it's not the best thing if you're going to just leave the gym and you're just completely glassy-eyed. You've got to go in, particularly if they need to go and get on with the rest of their day. You can pull them out of freeze and back through kind of freeze, flight, fight, and into flow back around this wheel. By doing that, it actually brings them back to sit up and be like, oh, right, I feel good. And how can I go and get on with my day?
I feel definitely more relaxed when I stood up.
Rich, you're essentially giving them a Shavasana.
Okay.
Which is like, which I have my clients do. I have them set up in a classic supported Shavasana where they put support underneath like the backs of their thighs.
Okay.
Neck roll, and then like an eye pillow over their eyes, and I just have them, or just depending on what they need or what their posture is, I'll have them put a blanket over some yoga blocks where they have just a slight raise of the chest. But I feel that that's necessary after any kind of activity, because you have to re-assimilate like the nervous system into like your daily life. I feel. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it triggers your vagal nerve, so it pulls you back into that parasympathetic state.
Yeah, I think Rich, if you could link any resources you have on that, that would be awesome, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, it was, yeah, it's about, particularly, and it can be done over Zoom. So you don't have to, if you want to get, if someone's feeling nervous about talking to you as a person, for the first time, you don't have to be there to make them feel better. It's actually a kind of a physical, without being able to touch them, interaction that you can either use at the start or the end.
That's really, I'm going to play around with that with some of my clients. I like that. Thank you for sharing. Hey, Phil, to answer your question, how do we know who's in our group? So it's going to be your small group combined with the small group probably above you. So I'm going to do 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. And then I think there might be a 7th one too, which I'll figure that one out. So yeah, just expect to be paired with the small group next to you. And I'll post all these instructions in the chat too. Anything else?
Go on, I'll do another one.
Yeah.
I posted it in the on the Slack thing, but it was probably, that's only been up there for the past couple of hours. I did the step test for the energy system thing, and I suppose I on the assault bike started at 50 RPM with an increase of 3 RPM every step as it went up. Started 50 was far too high as a beginning. I ended up completely blowing out after 36 minutes. So it didn't go to that 50. But in terms of my heart rate, it over that period, I mean, essentially it stepped up, and up, and it got to just short of 200 beats a minute. So I was giving it some beans on that. So you can see where it died off because basically the heart rate monitor stopped working properly, and then it kicked in. So my interpretation of that is that it didn't plateau, because effectively it just, technically I suppose it did plateau. I'm not going to go any higher than 200. When we say a plateau, is that literally like someone hits 160 and just can't get any higher, or what does the plateau look like?
It looks just like that. Yeah, they would go to 160 and it might look like flatline, or it might look like a what do they call, like a sigmoid, some sort of graph where it just like slowly peters off, but it's still slowly increasing. I don't think yours is doing that. I think yours is increasing. So yeah, that's a sign that the cardiac system is or isn't stressed. So if the cardiac system is stressed and it can't handle the load, then you're going to basically see it flatline, and that system's just basically toast at that point. Not that like you're going to stop training, but it's no longer within the demands of which it is capable of handling.
Cool. So so your cardiac's just stopped effectively being able to do its thing.
So you're going to have to, if you remember the compensation slide, you're going to have to kick on other systems to help pick up the slack. And then since they have an additional load, you're now going to fatigue even quicker at that point.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, because I'm going to test it against doing the speed preservation test, but I just didn't have those things. Although I did try it was a very different feeling, because I hadn't done rowing for a long time. I felt like on the rower doing a 1K row that I was just trying, I couldn't get enough air into me. Like I just could not. Whereas on the assault bike, I don't know, I think it might be the posture, being upright and being able to keep that, whereas having to bend over the whole time was just felt like I was compressing, and I just could not get enough oxygen in. I'm a bit unfit at the minute, so it was a horrendous feeling.
It could just be you don't have the posterior expansion as much to, you might be relying on your anterior expansion when you go in there. I don't know what your assessment is, but that could be the case. Yeah,
no, that sounds absolutely what it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. But thank you for doing that, by the way, too. I think that's really important for people to be able to see that. I'm really curious to see what happens with your speed preservation results as well.
I will post when I've done it.
Sweet. Anything else, guys, before we wrap it up here?
Yeah, one more question, Connor.
Please.
So, I know it's probably complicated, but what do you think about people with scoliosis? Like, do you see certain compensations or orientations that they have?
Yes. So here. We spent all of day 4 of the PRI presentation, which I still haven't put that. I've been so busy, but anyway, just to give you a PRI has 2 different types of scoliosis they talk about. They talk about pathocompensatory and regular scoliosis. I remember in the presentation, they talked about how 98% of scoliotic patients have a spine that starts rotating right, which I think makes sense in the context of what we're talking about. But non-pathological scoliosis curvatures, they're going to stand with their weight centered on their right leg, hips shifted laterally and prominent to the left. Typical starts in right AFIR and can progress to right AFER. Their right posterior thoracic prominence is primary prominence and is usually visible. Their left anterior rib flare. So it's basically just like a crazy left AIC pattern. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then you have pathocompensatory, which is, here it is, stands with weight centered on the left leg and AFER. So they're shifted on their left, but they're still out of their left hip.
Right.
May visually appear to be more balanced due to compensatory lumbosacral instability. And left anterior rib flare is also considered to be a prominence. Right scap is protracting, atypically elevated, with the right posterior rib cage prominence is present. And so basically with this person, they're going to present with a positive failed left obers, a pass right obers, but it may be positive due to compensations. Left thoracic HG abduction is limited, along with right IR, which is the typical right BC pattern. And basically, they still present as a left AIC with some of the assessments, but they're probably going to present much more dramatic, and some things will feel very, very limited. Like, for example, there's a trunk rotation test they talk about that you guys don't know about, but that's one thing that'll look different. But anyway, the difference is in treatment of these two individuals is with the regular scoliosis, the non-compensatory, what you want to do first is you want to do phase 1, neutrality at the pelvis and establish ZOA, then introduce left AFIR and left hip shifting, and then minimize left anterior rib prominence, maintain left ZOA and right apical expansion, then expand left posterior mediastinum. With the compensatory, you want to do phase 1, and then you want to stabilize the lumbosacral junction and minimize left lumbar prominence in the frontal plane, which basically means doing a lot of left adductor, left glute med stuff. So they talk about the right glute max, the left side lying knee towards knee. And then what you want to do is go after the rib cage and then potentially inhibit the left posterior capsule after that, because these people are standing on their left leg, but they're in AFER like that. You know what I mean? So at that point, you might need to stretch out that posterior hip capsule and get into that. Although I would probably honestly do that sooner, because I find that can be really helpful with those people.
Interesting. So like their rotation is just an exaggeration of the left AIC. Is that how they see it? Sort of, because it's like the natural rotation your body wants to take, but it's become structural.
On the non-compensatory, yes.
Okay. Right. Interesting. So with the you said on the how did the two differ in general?
So with the non-compensatory, it's like a left AIC on steroids type of deal. They're like all torqued up, but on the compensatory, they're going to appear to be more even because they're going to be shifted on their left leg. And then they're going to still have, that underlying thing every human has, but they're going to appear to be more neutral within their pelvis. And some of the specific tests PRI talk about are going to be flip-flopped. But in the context of the test we use, you're probably going to see this individual present as a lateral.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything else you would do training-wise, just more so because of more or less than like someone who's not scoliotic, basically?
I would for sure not do bilateral activities with them. I would probably have them not do anything crazy at first. I would have them just, I treat it like that one guy the second example I gave today, he's a great example of what I would do.
Okay, gotcha. But like so it sounds like not going too hard on the bilateral activities makes sense because they're just fundamentally a little bit more unbalanced. So it's just harder for them to take that load, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. They're gonna compensate all day, every day, in order to basically lift that load symmetrically.
Gotcha. And like if you have like a really heavy one, and like that compression will probably make it worse, right? Because you're just compressing so much on top of already being like kind of farther off where you want to be.
Oh yeah, because hip shifts always get worse the more stressed the system is.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. And then like because of the way that their spine is, you see that lateral more likely because they just have the inherent structure of it.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be, laterals are that, right? They're here and here. So they're like shifted over here and higher like that, but they're not in their left hip. That's the thing.
Right. Okay. Is there, so with the lateral, with a normal lateral, is there a rotational element to that, or is that more frontal?
There is always a rotational component because like biotensegrity model, but it is, if for the purposes of what you want to think about, you want to think about it as if like, that's the reason why we talk about it. Sagittal is like that, it's being pushed forward from above, and then lateral is lateral, and then oblique is combination, it's transverse, like so.
Okay, cool, thank you.
And if you want to read more about this, actually, I bought this book literally like a week ago, and this might be the most influential book in terms of like what PRI is and where they're coming from. They literally, I had no idea they talked about this. This is the PRI book right here. It's like, it's crazy.
Right.
They talk about superior T4 syndrome. They talk about the typical left AIC pattern, but they don't call it that. They talk about compensations I can't wait to dig into this and just read this whole thing, because it really is, I think, where PRI got a lot of their information.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I have a question, actually, like about both wides and narrows can have compressed and stiff rib cages from front and the back, but they're not necessarily in tertiary layer compensation. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah, like so like with the rib cage, you can't say like, oh, it's just a stiff rib cage. You know, it's not just because like the soft tissue around it is stiff, but more so that on a structural bone level, the ribs are just closer together. Yeah, like it's just sometimes like I just, because I observe the way a lot of people rotate and turn, and because we have the most flexibility like in our cervical spine, there's a lot of head turning instead of turning from the thoracic. And how much in attempting to rotate the torso and to rotate the body, that's where some injuries occur for that. Because of the immobility and compression. I wouldn't say overly. I wouldn't say there's like a plethora of like overly expanded rib cages. I would say rib cages are for the most part compressed. Am I going on?
Right.
Am I right there or no?
Just in their own way, and I think that's what's beautiful about the bodies. It's predictably compensatory many times. Assuming there's no trauma or missing body parts, then yes, it's very predictable, which I think is awesome. Because you know we're different, but we're not that different, right? We're going to find a way to compensate. It's the path of least resistance. And for people with 4 arms and 2 arms and 2 legs, and have a heart on the left side, a liver on the right, there's only so many ways you can do that via the path of least resistance.
Yeah, sometimes you know it's distinguishing between what is soft tissue related and what is actually structural related, and that's why we have these. That's why we have these objective assessments. All right, just like figuring stuff out. And thank you so much for the book recommendation.
Of course.
It's time for me to head to the gym, but thank you so much. You guys are awesome, and Happy New Year.
You as well. Thank you guys for sticking around. I will talk to you Thursday. See you guys.